the global manhunt for the Nazis who escaped prosecution for decades. The Phantom of Buenos Aires, Shadows of the Angel of Death. In the sultry, jasmine-scented nights of 1950s Buenos Aires, where the tango whispers secrets in candlelit cafés and the boulevards echo with the footsteps of old Europe, a different kind of legend took root, one cloaked not in fame, but in fear. Beneath the city's glamorous facade, where European expatriates danced through lives of reinvention, the name Josef Mengele, the angel of death, drifted like a ghost, unspoken yet always present. Mengele, the man who embodied the cold precision of Auschwitz's horrors, had not vanished into oblivion. He had simply changed addresses. While the world hunted shadows across continents, Mengele sipped wine in Recoleta cafés, blending into a German-speaking community that closed ranks in the face of justice. His legacy as the architect of twisted eugenic ideals, the man who sorted lives at the rail platforms of death, was whispered about behind curtains, denied with fervor by those who shielded him, and obscured by the false reports of his demise. In Argentina, he was not just hiding, he was thriving. With wealth, connections, and the complicity of fellow fugitives like Hans-Ulrich Rudel and Willem Sassen, Mengele slipped through the net cast by justice, even appearing in the Buenos Aires telephone directory in 1958. The paradox was chilling. The world's most wanted man walked freely among opera-goers and poets, his monstrous past nestled behind a polite smile and new name. The line between myth and man blurred as sightings surged, rumors deepened, and still, no arrest came. For some, it was unthinkable that he had survived. For others, it was inevitable. And in that uneasy space, the myth of Mengele refused to die. Whispers of the Hunter's Moon, the vanishing of Josef Mengele. In the restless twilight of post-war shadows, when the world began to stitch itself back together after the carnage of the Second World War, a different war continued. One not of tanks or fire, but of memory and retribution. Beneath the veil of justice, a spectral presence lingered. The name Josef Mengele, spoken not with authority, but with dread, with shivers passed between survivors and whispered in the corridors of power. Somewhere beyond the reach of courts and the hands of the law, the man who had orchestrated unimaginable cruelty at Auschwitz-Birkenau slipped through history like a ghost with a passport. By 1959, the illusion of safety he had cultivated was shattered when West Germany officially indicted him for mass murder and sadistic medical experimentation, naming him publicly as one of the darkest architects of Nazi evil. For Mengele, who had wandered the boulevards of Buenos Aires with an air of regal entitlement, this marked the end of ease and the return of fear. Argentina, once a gilded cage in which he had hidden comfortably among Nazi sympathizers and former SS officers, was no longer safe. What he did not yet know was that Germany's extradition request was only the beginning. The real threat was far closer, far more secretive, and utterly relentless. The Mossad had already begun to close in, not just on Mengele, but on the broader web of fugitives hiding in plain sight. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 was a seismic shift, a signal that Israel was no longer waiting for diplomacy. Eichmann, Hitler's logistical mastermind of the final solution, had also found refuge in Argentina, working at a Mercedes-Benz plant and moving unnoticed among everyday Argentinians. But Mossad agents had found him, stripped him of his false identity, and abducted him under the cover of night. During his captivity, they pressed him for the whereabouts of Mengele. At first, Eichmann, ever loyal to his twisted cause, refused to betray anything. He claimed ignorance, stating he had no contact, though it would later be revealed they had shared coffee and cake at the ABC Café, a spot frequented by the exiled elite of the Third Reich. In truth, Eichmann and Mengele never got along. Eichmann viewed Mengele as arrogant, haughty, too enamored with his own myth. Mengele, on the other hand, saw Eichmann as common, a bureaucrat of death, unworthy of his own superior intellect and breeding. Eichmann lived in a modest suburb, while Mengele inhabited the upper tiers of the émigré elite, socializing with Nazi aristocracy, doctors, intellectuals, and former officers of the Reich who had money, influence, and silence to offer. As Mossad turned the screws, Eichmann eventually cracked just enough to admit that Mengele was alive, probably still in Buenos Aires, but nothing more. He claimed no address, no contact, no involvement. But to Israel, Josef Mengele was more than a name on a list. He was the name. In Israel, Mengele's name evoked not just fear, but fury, a symbol of the butcher's hand, a specter whose very existence haunted survivors. At Auschwitz, his medical experiments had been hell reimagined in the sterile corridors of science, vivisections without anesthesia, eye color injections, organ removals, sterilization trials on children as young as 5. He sought to redefine humanity by erasing it, attempting to forge a master race through eugenics, while condemning those he deemed impure to suffering and death in his experimental theater of pain. By the time he left the camp, he was no longer a man. He had become the embodiment of terror, a living phantom of the Holocaust. Thus, when Eichmann's capture offered even the slimmest lead, Mossad chief Isser Harel was determined to seize it. A second operation, codenamed Mengele, was quickly put in motion, even while Eichmann was still being held in a covert safe house awaiting extraction. The agents, operating under false passports in a foreign land where discovery meant a lifetime in an Argentine prison, began scouring Buenos Aires. They received a potential address, a boarding house said to shelter the elusive doctor. Mossad operatives fanned out, risking exposure, approaching the residents undercover, asking careful but probing questions. Some even made deliberate mistakes in hopes of catching a helpful correction. "Is this where Dr. Men lives?" they asked, hoping for a reply. "Oh, you mean Dr. Mengele?" That might lead them to the right door. It was a dangerous game in a city of secrets. Buenos Aires, with its colonial facades and bustling avenues, housed one of the largest German-speaking populations outside Europe, over 250,000. Many were simply immigrants, but among them were men with blood on their hands, and many more willing to protect them. Argentina had long been a haven. During the war, President Juan Perón had cultivated covert ties with Himmler's SS intelligence networks. Post-war, it became a natural sanctuary for the defeated but unrepentant. Passports were provided, names changed, histories erased. In this tightly woven net of shared guilt, asking the wrong question to the wrong person could mean the end of the operation. Despite the danger, the agents persisted, but Mengele had already vanished. His departure wasn't the result of Israeli pressure. It was luck, instinct, or perhaps just paranoia finally well placed. He had slipped across the border into Paraguay just before the noose could tighten. The address Mossad had staked out turned up nothing. The boarding house was empty of ghosts. Harel, ever cautious, realized the operation could not be sustained. There were too many unknowns, and their Eichmann operation was nearing its critical phase. Mengele, for now, would remain out of reach. And so the agents returned home with only one prize: Eichmann, who would stand trial in Jerusalem and become the face of Nazi accountability. Mengele's trail, meanwhile, had gone cold. His disappearance would feed a legend that refused to die, sparking decades of false sightings, conspiracy theories, and international manhunts. What remained certain was this: the angel of death had slipped through their fingers, not because of cunning, but because of chance. In a world still coming to terms with the Holocaust's enormity, that single truth that Mengele had walked free for so long became its own kind of wound, one that never truly healed. 3 chasing shadows, the relentless hunt for the angel of death. When the gallows fell silent in December 1961, and Adolf Eichmann's lifeless body hung as the final punctuation mark to Israel's first great reckoning with Nazi evil, a haunting absence remained. An absence that throbbed like an open wound in the conscience of a nation that had vowed never to forget. For Isser Harel, the calculating and unyielding chief of the Mossad, the closure offered by Eichmann's conviction and execution was incomplete. One figure still moved through the world like a phantom beyond reach: Josef Mengele. The name alone conjured shudders: the camp doctor of Auschwitz, the man who turned twins into test subjects, who watched children die with cold curiosity in his quest to manipulate heredity. Harel's resolve deepened, and so began another mission, quieter, slower, and far more elusive. Senior Mossad agent Zvi Aharoni, the same field operative who had been instrumental in capturing Eichmann, was tasked once more to return to South America. This time, his target was even more slippery and infinitely more mythical. He adopted the persona of a historian writing about the SSS, a scholar with questions rather than accusations, his briefcase full of curiosity and silence. Alongside his team, Aharoni swept through Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Chile, chasing whispers that often led to nothing but empty houses and vanished names. Paraguay held promise, but as always, Mengele was a step ahead. Each clue led to a door just recently closed, a chair still warm, a coffee cup half full, evidence of presence, yet never the man himself. The pressure grew unbearable. Compared to the relative clarity of the Eichmann hunt, this pursuit was a labyrinth of deception, rumor, and time's erosion of memory. Then, a sliver of fortune emerged from the shadows. The team apprehended Willem Zassen, a former Dutch SS officer and Nazi propagandist, infamous for interviewing Eichmann before his capture. Zassen, now a war criminal himself, found leverage in desperation. When threatened with extradition for his own crimes, he offered something in return: information. He told the agents that Mengele was not in Paraguay as once believed, but had fled to Brazil. Zassen, once a drinking companion of Mengele, remembered details: a ranch near São Paulo, a quiet life under a false name, a mustache grown thick to obscure the gap in his teeth, a feature he knew could identify him. It was the kind of tip Mossad couldn't ignore. Aharoni, accompanied by Rafi Eitan, the stoic agent who had led the Eichmann snatch, traveled to Brazil. Their destination was a rural farm roughly 50 kilometers from São Paulo. For days they watched, hiding among the brush, scanning the horizon for any movement, any signal that they were in the right place. The days dragged on, and it seemed the lead was growing colder. But then, in the shimmer of afternoon heat, a man appeared. He moved with caution, flanked by what looked like protectors. The thick mustache was unmistakable, and something in his posture, his guarded mannerisms, rang a bell deep in the gut of the watchers. Aharoni would later insist that the man he saw was Mengele. After nearly 2 decades of evasion, it seemed the angel of death had finally been sighted. The weight of history seemed to tilt at that moment. The enormity of the crimes committed by this one man threatened to come crashing into the present with the force of justice long denied. Mengele had first arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, freshly promoted and barely past his 32nd birthday. What he saw there transformed him, not into a monster, but into something colder, an ideologue in pursuit of a twisted vision. He stood on the railway ramps during arrivals, not out of duty, but desire. He craved control, the power to choose life or death, waving his gloved hand like a god over trembling crowds. Mothers were torn from children. Fathers disappeared into smoke. For those with the misfortune of being twins, a different fate awaited. Mengele's fascination with heredity turned them into specimens. He injected dyes into their eyes, mutilated their organs, dissected one, and compared it to the living sibling. He wasn't just a killer, he was an artisan of pain, blending cruelty with academic obsession. Survivors recall how their mothers, desperate to shield them, clung to their hands in vain. One remembers the moment she and her sister, dressed in matching burgundy dresses, were plucked from the crowd because of that symmetry. Their mother, uncertain if being a twin meant life or death, whispered yes when asked if they were identical. That whisper sealed their fates. As the girls were dragged away, they saw their mother's arms stretched toward them, vanishing into a sea of screaming prisoners. Such moments never fade. They are burned into the minds of the survivors, etched into history like scars on skin. And so, when Mossad agents believed they had found the man behind such horrors, their restraint was profound. They did not move, surveillance only. Proof first, action later. Aharoni returned to Israel with his report, confident that he had seen Mengele. But Isser Harel, now older, wearier, and facing new challenges, hesitated. It had been more than 16 years since the war's end, and the only photograph available was from 1938. Time and distance had transformed the fugitive, and Harel questioned whether a visual sighting was enough to justify a full-blown operation. The world was changing. The political climate in Latin America was volatile, and the risk of failure could jeopardize Israel's delicate diplomatic posture. Despite Aharoni's passion, the mission was suspended. The hunt was paused not for lack of will, but for want of certainty. Still, in the deep records of Mossad and the memory of those who watched that farm near São Paulo, one fact remains clear. They had found him. They had seen the angel of death, but for now, he remained just beyond reach. The line between justice and myth blurred once again, and the name Mengele faded back into the shadows, alive, silent, and untouched. The Vanishing Phantom, the final flight of Josef Mengele. In the twilight of history, where the scars of war linger like ghosts in the mist, one name whispers through the ages with a chilling resonance: Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. A figure cloaked in infamy, his legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of horror, paranoia, and unrelenting pursuit. As the world grappled with the aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse, Mengele slipped through the cracks of justice, a spectral presence evading capture while his crimes cast long shadows over humanity's conscience. From the ashes of Auschwitz, where his twisted experiments on human lives defied the boundaries of morality, to the remote corners of South America, where he lived as a fugitive haunted by his own fears, Mengele's story is one of calculated escape, fleeting prosperity, and a descent into a life of isolation and dread. His journey, spanning decades and continents, reveals not only the depths of his depravity, but also the failures and complexities of a world struggling to hold its monsters accountable. This is the tale of a man who fled the gallows but could not escape the specter of his own guilt, a narrative that unfolds with the hypnotic pull of a nightmare from which there is no awakening. Born into a wealthy family in Günzburg, Germany, Mengele's early life was marked by privilege and ambition. The Mengele family, proprietors of a thriving farm machinery business, held sway over their company town, their name synonymous with influence and affluence. Yet, beneath this veneer of respectability, Josef harbored a fascination with eugenics and racial purity, ideologies that would find a sinister outlet in the service of the Nazi regime. As a young doctor, he joined the SS with zeal, his academic brilliance twisted into a tool of destruction at Auschwitz, where he conducted experiments on twins and others with a cold, methodical precision that earned him his grim moniker. When the Red Army closed in on the camp in January 1945, Mengele fled, clutching a suitcase filled with his scientific notes, grotesque trophies of his inhumanity. Captured by American forces in June 1945, he escaped scrutiny through a stroke of vanity. Unlike other SS officers, he had refused the blood-type tattoo under his arm, a narcissistic choice that allowed him to slip through the Allies' net. Released under an assumed identity, he drifted through a shattered Germany, living on a Bavarian farm, supported by his family's wealth and the loyalty of their trusted retainer, Hans Zedelmeier. As the Nuremberg trials cast a spotlight on Nazi atrocities, Mengele's fear of capture grew, pushing him to orchestrate a daring escape. With his family's resources and Zedelmeier's connections, he navigated a clandestine route through Austria and Italy, securing an Argentine landing permit under the alias Helmut Gregor. In August 1949, he stepped onto the docks of Buenos Aires, a new chapter of his life, beginning in a land that offered sanctuary to many of Hitler's fugitives. For a decade, from 1949 to 1959, Mengele thrived in Argentina, his past buried beneath the guise of a prosperous businessman. Selling farm machinery across South America, he leveraged his family's expertise to build a comfortable life, mingling with expatriate communities and former Nazis who had found refuge in the region. Buenos Aires, with its vibrant streets and relative anonymity, provided a stark contrast to the chaos of war-torn Europe. Yet, even in this haven, Mengele's arrogance and charisma masked a latent unease, a sense that his carefully constructed facade could crumble. His world began to unravel in 1959 when the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann by Israeli agents sent shockwaves through the Nazi diaspora. Eichmann's trial and execution in Israel ignited a firestorm of fear among war criminals, and Mengele, acutely aware of his own notoriety, realized his days of carefree living were numbered. The extradition request from West Germany forced him to abandon Argentina, his once secure existence giving way to a nomadic life of constant vigilance. He fled to Paraguay, then Brazil, moving from one rural outpost to another, his wealth dwindling as his paranoia deepened. In Brazil's wilds, he built a watchtower on a remote farm, a commanding perch from which he surveyed the surrounding landscape, ever watchful for the pursuers he believed were closing in. A pack of dogs became his constant companions, their barking a soundtrack to his growing isolation. Mengele's fear was not unfounded. West German prosecutors were quietly building a case against him, while private individuals like Simon Wiesenthal kept his name alive as a symbol of Nazi evil. Yet, unbeknownst to him, Israel's Mossad had quietly disbanded its Mengele hunting unit, a decision that did little to ease his terror. He lived in the shadow of Eichmann's fate, convinced that a similar end awaited him. Mengele's life in Brazil was a far cry from the opulence of his Argentine years. He drifted between modest farms, working as an itinerant manager, his medical expertise occasionally surfacing in moments that betrayed his true identity. On one farm, he performed a delicate hernia operation on a young boy, an act that left locals whispering about the enigmatic European in their midst. His physical and mental state deteriorated. He developed a nervous habit of chewing his mustache so obsessively that it formed a hairball, a grotesque symbol of his unraveling. The myth of Mengele, however, grew larger than the man himself. Popular culture, fueled by figures like Wiesenthal, painted him as a sinister mastermind holed up in a jungle fortress, surrounded by loyal minions and armed to the teeth. Novels like The Boys from Brazil and Hollywood's fascination with Nazi villains cemented this image, but the reality was far more pathetic. A solitary, aging man living in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of São Paulo, consumed by dread. Sightings of Mengele proliferated from southern Spain to a Greek island, yet no serious effort was made to track him down. His family's wealth and Sedlmayr's loyalty ensured he received funds and support, a lifeline that kept him afloat but tethered him to a network of secrets that would eventually unravel. In West Germany, prosecutors suspected Sedlmayr's involvement but accepted his denials under oath, allowing the trail to go cold. The world's indifference to Mengele's fate was a bitter irony, a reflection of the broader reluctance to confront the lingering presence of Nazi war criminals. By the late 1970s, Mengele's legend had grown outlandish, but his reality was one of squalor and despair. The efforts of survivors like Eva Kor, who in 1985 led a group of Auschwitz twins to the camp for a mock trial in Jerusalem, began to rekindle global attention. Their testimonies of Mengele's cruel experiments, his immaculate appearance juxtaposed with his barbaric acts, piled pressure on governments to act. The 40th anniversary of Auschwitz's liberation marked a turning point, with multi-million-dollar rewards offered and an international task force formed to coordinate the hunt. A critical tip came in May 1985, when Sedlmayr, after years of guarding Mengele's secrets, let slip to a friend while drinking that he had supported the fugitive. This betrayal led German authorities to raid Sedlmayr's home, where they uncovered a cache of letters revealing Mengele's death in Brazil in 1979. Brazilian police descended on a São Paulo address linked to a German couple, the Bosserts, who had sheltered Mengele in his final years. A makeshift shrine to Mengele, complete with his writings and photographs, confirmed their complicity. The Bosserts admitted to burying him in a pauper's grave, and the exhumation of a 6-year-old corpse brought closure to one of history's most enduring manhunts. Mengele, the man who had once wielded godlike power over life and death, had died alone, his paranoia, his myth far outstripping the frail, broken figure he had become. His story is a haunting reminder of the evil that thrives in silence, the fragile triumph of justice, and the enduring power of memory to confront the past. explore Mengele's experiments, Nazi war criminal hideouts. 5. The Phantom of Justice, the haunting pursuit of Josef Mengele. It began not with a whisper, but with a roar, an electric thrum of morbid fascination that drew crowds like moths to a flame, converging under the searing South American sun at a remote cemetery in Brazil. Word had spread like wildfire. The notorious angel of death, Josef Mengele, was dead. His skull, unearthed and bleached by time, was held aloft under the unblinking eye of the camera, a grim relic for the world to see. Snap, snap, snap. The shutters clicked like the closing of a case, yet nothing felt resolved. Even in death, Mengele's presence was spectral, elusive, defiant. Doubt lingered in the humid air, thick with conspiracy and suspicion. Was it truly him? Or had the master of deception once again manipulated the world stage from beyond the grave? For decades, Mengele had been a symbol of unpunished evil, a ghost in the corridors of justice, evading capture with uncanny precision. He had the means, the medical knowledge, and the cold ambition to fake his own demise. His legend had grown grotesquely mythic, part man, part monster, all menace. And now, here lay his bones, supposedly. But skeptics cried foul, their disbelief fed by years of false sightings and unconfirmed whispers from the jungles of Paraguay to the suburbs of São Paulo. An international coalition formed, an unprecedented alliance of nations united not by politics, but by pursuit. From Germany, Brazil, Israel, and the United States came elite forensic scientists, dental analysts, pathologists, and radiologists. Each brought with them fragments of truth to fit the puzzle of a vanishing man. The Israeli Defense Forces dispatched their top forensic pathologist, joining hands with other experts to extract the story that lay dormant in the bones. The first breakthrough came through a fusion of art and science, a haunting facial reconstruction that merged a photograph of the living Mengele with the contours of the exhumed skull. The result was chillingly persuasive, a face from nightmares, revived by science, gazing back through time with cold indifference. But the world remained unconvinced. In an age of deep fakes and digital illusions, it would take more than visual resemblance to silence the doubters. The bones, weathered and silent, needed to speak in a language no one could deny. That voice came in the form of DNA. In the early 1990s, forensic genetics had matured into a precise, damning force of truth. The remains from Brazil were shipped under heavy guard to a high-security lab in England. There, technicians ground the brittle remains with surgical care, coaxing out a minuscule amount of genetic material, just enough to summon a verdict. The analysis was painstaking, the implications monumental. When the results came in, they left no room for speculation. The remains were indeed Josef Mengele's. The final curtain had fallen on a man who had lived in the shadows, cloaked in denial and myth. Justice, though late, had found its silent resolution in bone and blood. With that, the ghost of Mengele was finally laid to rest, not with a trial, not with confession, but with the irrevocable testimony of science. The quiet end of a shadow, Josef Mengele's final days. Not with justice, not with judgment, but with silence and salt water did Josef Mengele meet his end. An end as anticlimactic as it was tragically fitting. No court, no sentence, no reckoning before a jury of humanity. Only the hush of the Brazilian coast and the soft pulse of waves lapping against a quiet beach house in Bertioga. It was there, some 30 miles from São Paulo, under the guise of a hot summer day, that the world's most infamous fugitive slipped away. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost pitiful whimper. For years, he had lived a life of concealment and paranoia, cloaked in borrowed names and friends too afraid or too complicit to reveal his secrets. He was a man hunted not only by nations, but by the crushing weight of his own notoriety. Always reluctant to leave the safety of the shaded indoors, he avoided sunlight not just for fear of being recognized, but perhaps because even nature felt accusatory to him. Yet on that fateful day, coaxed by companions and the illusion of anonymity, he agreed to take a swim. A rare act of surrender to normalcy, the ocean, beautiful and brutal in equal measure, became the final witness to his struggle. The currents were strong, deceptive in their calm, and as he drifted out too far, signs of distress surfaced quickly. Witnesses would later recount a sudden panic, a desperate effort to stay afloat, and then the limpness of a man succumbing, not just to water, but to the stroke that overtook him mid-swim. Attempts to resuscitate him failed, and in the end he died either by drowning or from the paralysis of the stroke itself. Either way, the result was the same. Mengele, the architect of selections, the angel of death, was gone. But even in death, the question of what to do with him cast long ethical shadows. His friends debated cremation, a practical solution that would have conveniently erased what little physical proof remained. But the family, distant in name and in spirit, refused to sign the necessary documents. And so, his body remained, buried under a false name, hidden but intact, until it was exhumed years later in a dramatic turn of forensic history. Had they succeeded in cremating him, the fog of uncertainty might never have lifted. The truth might have dissolved in flame, and the world might still whisper that he lived. His victims were denied the solemn spectacle of a trial, denied the moment when he would stand and answer for the unspeakable crimes committed under his command. Mengele had orchestrated death in industrial proportions. At Auschwitz, human beings were categorized, selected, and extinguished as though part of a vast and grotesque machine. The Holocaust was not just murder, it was engineered extinction, and Mengele was one of its coldest minds. To see him fade anonymously into old age, rather than face the gavel of history, felt like betrayal to many. For those who had pursued him relentlessly, obsessively, the lack of closure was a wound that never quite healed. Some, like famed Nazi hunters, carried the failure like a personal curse, wondering if they should have tried harder, moved faster, pushed further. Yet others offered a quieter reflection, that Mengele's later years were not ones of triumph, but of torment. He lived as a bitter, isolated man, increasingly anxious and depressed, fearful of every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street. He was not a villain in a castle, but a ghost in exile, hunted by nations and haunted by history. That, they say, is its own kind of punishment. Not enough, perhaps, for the scale of his crimes, but not nothing either. In the absence of a trial, the world is left with fragments. The knowledge that he did not live gloriously, that he died quietly, that his remains were eventually dragged into the light and confirmed by science. His death may not have satisfied the longing for justice, but it stripped away the myth of the untouchable fugitive. No, he did not escape unscathed. No, he did not die a hero or even a man of peace. He died as he lived in the shadows, alone, afraid, and forgotten by the very ideals he once claimed to serve. 7 echoes of the unfinished war, the Clarfelds, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It began not in the shadowy alleys of Berlin or the haunted barracks of Auschwitz, but in the quiet hum of post-war Europe, where the dust of destruction had settled, and the perpetrators of its horrors had slipped unnoticed into normal lives. The world moved forward, economies rebuilt, cities healed. But in the stillness, a question lingered, sharp and silent. What justice had ever been done? While countless graves remained unmarked, the architects of mass murder lived undisturbed, sipping coffee in middle-class apartments, sending their children to school, managing grain companies, or serving as judges and officials. One such man was Kurt Lischka, former Gestapo chief in Paris, the orchestrator of the arrest and deportation of 33,000 Jews, now living openly in Cologne. This was not the stuff of fiction, but the raw truth uncovered by two determined souls, Serge and Beate Klarsfeld, a French-German couple bound by history, love, and the haunting weight of unavenged death. For them, the Holocaust was not a chapter in a history book. It was a living, breathing wound. Serge, a French Jew whose own family had been scarred by Nazi terror, and Beate, a German woman who felt it was her destiny to confront her country's unburied crimes, did not merely mourn the past. They chased its ghosts. There was no momentum within the legal systems of post-war Germany to prosecute these men. A legal loophole had emerged like a stain on the national conscience. Nazis convicted in other countries could live freely within Germany, immune from extradition due to the absence of reciprocal agreements. For Lischka and others, it was a perverse sanctuary. The Klarsfelds, unwilling to let this stand, launched their own campaign, not as vigilantes, but as witnesses determined to hold a mirror up to the face of a forgetful nation. It started with surveillance. From their home in Paris, they made their way to Cologne, where they gathered Lischka's address and telephone number with shocking ease. The man who once engineered genocide was now working as an executive in the grain shipping industry, his days marked by mundane routine and peaceful anonymity. But the Klarsfelds were watching. Armed with nothing more than a camera and conviction, they tracked his movements, capturing him on film as he made his way to the streetcar each morning, briefcase in hand, a cigarette pressed to his lips, an image of normalcy that stood in grotesque contrast to the monstrous past it concealed. When Lischka noticed Serge beside him, camera in hand, he panicked. He ran. And in that moment, caught on tape, history shifted. The great head of the Gestapo in Paris, the man who sent tens of thousands to their deaths, was now fleeing down a German street like a criminal cornered by truth. It was not just the Klarsfelds chasing him. It was memory. It was justice. It was every scream from the cattle cars echoing into the present. Yet Germany remained unmoved. Despite the footage, despite the outrage of survivors, despite the meticulous documentation, no arrest was made. The public reaction was muted, the government indifferent. The legal barricades remained intact, but the Klarsfelds were not content to surrender to silence. If the law would not move, then they would. They conceived an audacious plan, not out of vengeance, but necessity. They would kidnap Lischka and deliver him to France, where he had already been convicted in absentia. They would force justice to happen, but to do so, they needed help. They recruited a small team: Eli, a photographer whose mother had perished in Auschwitz, Marco, a university friend, and David, a doctor with judo training. Each had their own scars, but all were united by Serge and Beate's unshakable belief that evil unpunished was evil condoned. Beate had observed Lischka's habits for days, his precise departure times, his lunch hour routine. The plan was to intercept him as he walked home at midday, bundle him into a car, and ferry him across the border. They had even rented vehicles to switch en route to avoid being traced. But fate resisted. The rental car promised, a 4-door, ideal for a swift abduction, was swapped with a 2-door model, complicating everything. And when the moment came to strike, nerves frayed. Eli froze, paralyzed not by fear of Lishka, but by the crushing weight of what they were about to do. The attempt failed. Lishka remained free. The team retreated in frustration, regrouping in a nearby cafe. It would have been easy to quit, to tell themselves they had tried. But Serge, with a voice hardened by loss and years of disappointment, reminded them why they were there. They were not chasing a man. They were pursuing history. They were chasing the very concept of moral accountability. What they were doing was not a crime. It was a reckoning. The mission to kidnap Lishka would not end in that moment. The battle against injustice would continue, sometimes in courtrooms, sometimes in the streets, often in silence. But the Klarsfelds had reignited something. In a world dulled by time, they reminded everyone that justice, delayed or denied, was still justice worth fighting for. Their pursuit was a hypnotic testament to the idea that memory must be armed with action, and that even the most ordinary streets can carry the footprints of heroes. It did not begin with outrage. It did not begin with sirens, courtrooms, or a collective reckoning. It began instead in a hushed void, an absence so deafening it screamed. In the years following World War II, as Europe limped back into prosperity and nations stitched themselves into new alliances and economies, the ghosts of the Holocaust roamed free, not merely in memory, but in flesh. The architects of genocide, those who drafted the orders, signed the lists, scheduled the trains, resumed their lives with disturbing ease. Some lived in plain sight. Others prospered, blending effortlessly into the landscape of post-war normalcy. Among them was Kurt Lishka, one of the central figures responsible for the deportation of Jews from France. From his comfortable residence in Cologne, he went to work as a grain executive, living a routine life, while the echoes of his past whispered beneath every cobblestone. For most, he was just another citizen. For Serge and Beat Klarsfeld, he was the embodiment of unpunished evil. It wasn't just about one man. It was the broader sickness of impunity that enraged them. They had discovered that many Nazi officials responsible for the French Jewish deportations were living freely in Germany, their names unchanged, their reputations unblemished. These were men who had not gone into hiding, but into promotion, becoming lawyers, judges, businessmen. And Germany, paralyzed by legal loopholes and a reluctant judiciary, refused to act. The Klarsfelds sought not vengeance, but moral intervention. They needed the world to see what it had allowed to fester. For Lishka, the crimes were precise, systematic, and devastating. In May 1942, he decreed that all Jews over 6 years of age wear the yellow star of David. Just 2 months later, he ordered what would become one of the most shameful events in French history, the Vel d'Hiv roundup. On July 16, 1942, 13,000 Jews, 4,000 of them children, were arrested, torn from homes and schools, and eventually transported to Auschwitz. More than half never returned. Among those nearly taken was Simon Jerkum, a young boy whose life was saved only by his mother's desperate plea to a cleaning woman to hide them for a night. He still remembers watching his mother cry in front of a stranger. It was the last time he saw her. His parents were arrested trying to flee into the unoccupied zone and were gassed in Auschwitz barely a month later. His story, like thousands of others, lived on in fragments of memory and the quiet despair of survivors who endured both loss and the insult of impunity. For Serge, it was intolerable. For Beate, it became destiny. Their first attempted kidnapping of Lishka failed, foiled by poor timing, nerves, and an inconvenient police presence. But failure didn't mean surrender. It meant escalation. They regrouped. They planned again. At precisely 12:45 p.m. on a second attempt, they moved in. Serge and his team approached Lishka on the street, grabbed him by the arms, and tried to wrestle him toward their vehicle. The man was tall and heavy, and he resisted. He cried out for help. He fell to the ground. Stunned but conscious, he shouted again, "My hat! I want my hat!" The absurdity of the moment collided with the gravity of the act. The police arrived. The plan unraveled. The Klarsfelds fled. Beate, on the opposite side of the street, remained behind. But this was not the end. It was the spark. The next day, German newspapers were quiet, barely a footnote on what should have been a national scandal. So, the Klarsfelds picked up the phone. Beate pretended to be a concerned neighbor, wondering how such a horrific assault on a poor old man hadn't made the news. Her call forced the authorities to acknowledge the event, and then came the headlines. But Beate wanted more than headlines. She wanted consequence. She returned to Cologne and presented herself to the police. She admitted everything. "Yes, I organized the kidnapping attempt," she told them, "because Germany refuses to ratify the treaty with France, and because Kurt Lishka is a free man." The police, hesitant and uncomfortable, declined to arrest her. They recognized the symbolic weight of her confession. What was unfolding wasn't a criminal conspiracy, it was a moral ambush on German inertia. By March 31, 1971, Beate returned again, not with ropes or plans, but with paper, documents, records, letters, lists. In the company of Holocaust survivors, she delivered a damning dossier to the Cologne prosecutor. Each sheet bore the fingerprints of history. Each page marked with Lishka's initials was a whisper from the grave. The scale of his involvement was unmistakable. Orders signed, roundups coordinated, deportations executed. His name was everywhere. He had been the direct pipeline between Eichmann in Berlin and the death factories in Poland. He had not acted in isolation. He had acted with precision, and now his acts were undeniable. Still, the German authorities hesitated. Legal frameworks remained tangled. Political will was weak. But the Klarsfelds had shifted the terrain. They had exposed not only Lishka, but the entire machinery of post-war forgetfulness. Their campaign was not simply about a single arrest. It was about awakening a nation to its buried truth. And even if the courts faltered, they had succeeded in another, quieter way. They had given voice to the silenced, dignity to the forgotten, and forced history to remember what justice had tried to forget. A battle for memory. The Klarsfelds and the relentless war against forgetting. Justice, when left to the slow turn of courts and the cold ink of policy, often loses its pulse. In post-war Europe, as rubble turned into homes and industries replaced ruins, one thing was notably absent from the reconstruction: accountability. The air was thick with denial. Official forgetfulness had seeped into the walls of government buildings, and the great silence that followed the Holocaust gave cover to men who should have faced the judgment of nations. Kurt Lishka, the former Gestapo chief in Paris, was one of them. From his desk during the German occupation of France, he had orchestrated terror with administrative efficiency. He signed orders for arrests, mandated the wearing of yellow stars, and dispatched tens of thousands of Jews, 4,000 of them children, during the notorious Veldehive roundup on July 16, 1942, toward deportation and death. He was a man whose hands, though perhaps never blood-stained directly, had processed death with bureaucratic calm. And yet, 3 decades later, he was not behind bars, but behind a desk once again, this time as a business executive in Cologne. He walked freely, untouched by law, unburdened by remorse. Into this void of action stepped 2 unlikely warriors, Serge and Bete Klarsfeld. Their names would become synonymous with the pursuit of justice where law had failed. Serge, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, had lost his father to Auschwitz. Bete, a German woman, born into a nation reluctant to look inward, found herself unable to accept the quiet integration of Nazi criminals back into everyday life. Together, they did not merely mourn history, they dragged it, kicking and screaming, into the present. They stalked former Nazis not with violence, but with files, cameras, newspapers, and when all else failed, the terrifying clarity of personal sacrifice. They began with documentation. It was an indisputable truth that many Nazi officials responsible for the Holocaust in France had returned to Germany and slipped quietly into professional roles. Judges, lawyers, civil servants, these were the second lives of men who had once sent thousands to their deaths. For Serge and Beate, the inaction of German authorities was more than a legal oversight. It was moral complicity. They were particularly enraged by the case of Kurt Lischke. His crimes were documented in meticulous detail, and yet no action had been taken. A legal loophole, one that prevented the extradition of Nazi criminals convicted in France but living in Germany, meant he was immune from justice. This technicality, absurd in its cruelty, was allowing mass murderers to live out their lives unpunished. The Klarsfelds sought to change that. They confronted Lischke publicly. They filmed him. They followed his movements. They turned their search into a public performance. Each confrontation, each protest, a cry against collective amnesia. But still, nothing changed. The newspapers were largely silent. German officials refused to act. It became clear that exposure was not enough. They needed to provoke the system, to force it into a dilemma. And so, in a move that stunned even their supporters, they attempted to kidnap Lischke. The first attempt failed. They were unprepared. Lischke resisted. Police intervened, but Beate, ever strategic, turned that failure into a public challenge. She returned to Cologne and openly confessed her role in the attempted abduction. She handed herself to the police, daring them to act. Her arrest threw the German justice system into disarray. If they jailed her, a young woman, a mother who was fighting for justice, while Lischke walked free, it would cast an unflattering light on their priorities. If they released her, they would admit to their own helplessness in the face of Nazi impunity. They chose the former. Bete was incarcerated for 2 weeks in Endorf prison, and for the Klarsfelds, every moment was worth it. Her arrest made headlines. It stirred outrage. Protests erupted. French newspapers championed her cause, and survivors, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens rallied behind her. The authorities had unwittingly played into their hands. Still, the stakes grew higher. The Klarsfelds received threats. One day, a parcel arrived at their Paris home, addressed charmingly and wrapped like a gift. Serge, suspicious, opened it carefully. Inside, he found a box that looked like chocolates, but buried within the wrapping paper was a bomb. 300 grams of dynamite and 500 grams of nails. It would have destroyed the entire apartment. By sheer luck, Beta and the children were not home. Serge took the package to the police in a plastic bag, joking grimly, "I've got a bomb." The police were not amused. "You're lucky to be alive," they told him. These were not empty threats from anonymous cranks. These were targeted, tactical attempts to silence them. And yet they did not stop. "We took the threat seriously," Serge would later say, "but we never stopped." In May 1973, Beta made another bold move. 7 months pregnant, she entered Lischka's office, flanked by Auschwitz survivors. They were there not just to protest, but to confront him face to face. The moment peeled away the veneer of his new life. The calm, modern businessman revealed his true nature. In a panic, he pulled a gun and shoved one of the demonstrators against the wall. The old instincts of Gestapo brutality, never far beneath the surface, had returned. He feared the Klarsfelds, not for their weapons, but for their persistence. They were dragging him back to the truth he had buried. Still, Germany's legal system did not budge. The bureaucracy was thick, and the political will was faint. Serge knew they had to push harder. He remembered the day the Gestapo burst into his home in Nice. He was 8 years old. His father was taken. Serge, his mother and sister, hid in a false compartment behind the closet. A German officer opened the door, sifted through the clothes, and by a miracle did not find them. In the morning, they escaped. But Serge's father never returned. Arnold Klarsfeld died in Auschwitz in 1944. The memory of that night and of the silence that followed it shaped Serge's resolve. He would not let his father's death remain unchallenged. In December 1973, 3 years into their campaign, Serge took the most personal risk yet. He traveled alone to Cologne, armed with a pistol. This was not a random act of violence. This was a symbolic confrontation, a way to force the state's hand. He waited outside Lischka's office, watching. When the former Gestapo chief exited and moved toward his car, Sergei stepped forward. He pressed the gun to Lischka's head. In that instant, the past and present collided. Lischka's eyes widened in terror. Sergei had become the mirror, the reckoning, the moment his victims never had. But he did not pull the trigger. That would be an act of despair, he later explained. I didn't survive for nothing. Instead, he smiled, laughed, and fled. It was not an assassination. It was a warning. It was a performance of justice denied, a reminder that if the law failed, retribution might come from elsewhere. Back in Paris, Serge delivered his message to the prosecutors. You see, if we wanted to kill these criminals, we could, even with a gun, even when they are protected. And if you don't do your duty, someone else will. The confrontation had the desired effect. The authorities, finally pushed beyond their bureaucratic limits, relented. After years of delay, debate, and public pressure, the German government passed a new law. In January 1975, 5 years after the Klarsfelds had begun their campaign, the law was ratified. It allowed for the prosecution in Germany of Nazi war criminals previously convicted abroad. It became known informally as the Klarsfeld Law. It was not the end of the struggle. Justice for Holocaust perpetrators would always remain imperfect. Many died before they could be tried. Some were never identified. But the law stood as a monument to persistence, to moral courage, to the idea that justice, though slow and often elusive, must still be pursued. The Klarsfelds did what nations would not. They turned the absence of justice into a rallying cry. They turned themselves into instruments of memory. Through protest, confrontation, and personal risk, they held up a mirror to Europe and forced it to look. Their story is not just about the Nazis they chased. It is about the power of the human will when fused with conscience. It is about a couple who believed that memory must be weaponized, that silence is not neutral, and that the passage of time does not erase responsibility. They did not act with armies. They acted with cameras, leaflets, legal files, and sometimes with nothing but moral fire. They fought not only for their own families, but for all those who were lost without a voice. And in doing so, they changed history, not with force, but with the unrelenting demand to remember. 9. The long pursuit. When memory demands judgment. Justice, when it comes late, does not arrive gently. It crashes into history like a long-forgotten storm returning to claim its thunder. For Serge and Beta Klarsfeld, the war they waged was not one bound by borders or guns, but by memory, persistence, and the unshakable belief that no crime against humanity should be left unanswered, no matter how many years have passed. Their campaign to bring Nazi war criminal Kurt Lischka to justice had already moved mountains, forcing the German legal system to close a loophole that had shielded men like him for decades. The law had changed, but their fight was far from over. They knew too well that paper alone doesn't bring judgment. It must be followed by action, by consequence, by trials that force a country and the world to look in the mirror and not look away. In July 1978, 2 years after the Klarsfeld law was passed, the breakthrough finally came. German police arrested Kurt Lischka for the murder of 3,000 French Jews. For Serge and Beata, the moment was powerful, not only for what it represented, but for what it shattered. The arrogant belief among former Nazis that they had outlived justice. The men they had stalked, filmed, and publicly named, men who once mocked the idea of consequence, were now preparing to stand trial in Cologne. It was an immense victory, but one that came with a price. The Klarsfelds were no strangers to threats, but what came next was far more dangerous. One night, they heard an explosion near their apartment block. It wasn't until the smoke cleared that they realized their car had been destroyed by a bomb, detonated just beneath the spot where Serge would have parked that morning before driving his young daughter to school. Subsequent investigations confirmed the horrifying truth. This was not just an act of intimidation, but a planned assassination. It was meant to kill. Still, they did not retreat. If you're obsessed with security, Serge once said, you cannot do anything. Courage had long been their currency, and they spent it without hesitation. On October 23, 1979, the trial of Kurt Lischka opened in Cologne, and even as justice seemed within reach, the Klarsfelds knew the work was not done. Trials are not only about evidence and verdicts. They are about public memory, about awakening a society that has grown comfortable forgetting. To make this trial resonate, the Klarsfelds transformed it into a living testimony. They brought survivors, former inmates of French concentration camps, to the courthouse, many of them still in possession of their faded uniforms, still bearing the yellow Star of David on their chests. These were not symbols of pity, but of survival, defiance, and truth. Alongside Lischka stood 2 other Nazi officials, Ernst Heinrichson, his deputy, and Herbert Hagen, a high-ranking SS figure during the occupation. All 3 men were ushered into the courtroom in suits, looking more like tired bureaucrats than orchestrators of genocide. Their expressions were not of guilt, but of confusion. Why, after all this time, were they here? Why had the world remembered? The Klarsfelds answered not with words, but with action. For the verdict, they arranged one final act of symbolic power. They chartered a train from France carrying 1,500 French Jews to Germany. It was not an ordinary train, but a replica of the very cattle wagons that once transported Jews eastward to the extermination camps. This was not just a journey to a trial, it was a reenactment of memory itself. As the train pulled into Cologne and the passengers, survivors, descendants, and supporters marched through the city streets, chants rang out, "Lischka, murderer!" In that moment, the powerless became powerful. The silenced had a voice. History was no longer buried in books, it was walking through the heart of Germany. 9 years after they first began staking out Lischka's apartment, after countless protests, threats, and near-death experiences, Serge and Beate finally witnessed the result of their struggle. All 3 defendants were found guilty. Lischka was sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was not enough for the scale of his crimes. Many thought no number would ever be enough. But it was a verdict. It was a line drawn in history. Yet even that justice was bittersweet. Lischka would serve only 5 of his 10 years, released in the mid-1980s on grounds of ill health. He died in a nursing home, far from the ashes of Auschwitz, far from the screams of the Veldihiv children he had sent to their deaths. Still, the Klarsfelds never measured victory by punishment alone. The trial, for them, was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. It was the confrontation of a nation with the part of itself it preferred to ignore. This trial was, for us, the trial of those who lived unpunished in Germany for more than 30 years, Serge said. And eventually, they were sentenced, not by the Germany of the past, but by a new Germany, one that we had helped shape. Through courage, documentation, and relentless will, Serge and Beta Klarsfeld forced a reckoning that the world never intended to have. They proved that the passing of time does not absolve responsibility, and that memory, when wielded with purpose, can shake even the most resistant institutions. Their war was not just for justice, it was against forgetting. And in that war, they did not fail. The Last Arrest. Paul Touvier and the Reckoning of a Nation. Not every war ends when the guns fall silent. Some wars continue, quietly and invisibly, in files buried deep in court archives, in forgotten wounds never properly dressed, in the silent prayers of those who have waited too long for justice. It had been 43 years since the fall of Nazi Germany, and yet in France, one ghost of the occupation still evaded the hands of justice: Paul Touvier. A man once loyal to Vichy, a collaborator so consumed by his ideological hatred that he hunted Jews and resistance fighters with a personal zeal that earned him the dark distinction of being among France's most reviled war criminals. He was a shadow that refused to fade, protected by time, silence, and powerful sympathizers. For decades, he had escaped retribution, even faking his own death to seal the illusion of disappearance. But in March of 1988, that fragile illusion began to crack when Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon, a determined and unrelenting investigator with a reputation for solving impossible cases, was quietly handed the Touvier file by a magistrate of the Paris court. This was not a routine assignment, it was a mission cloaked in secrecy, skepticism, and danger. From the start, Recordon knew the odds were against him. The trail was old, the records were thin, and Touvier's supporters, many of them embedded in France's powerful institutions, would not go quietly. But Recordon was not a man easily dissuaded. When I began, he would later say, "Nothing could stop me." His first step was to immerse himself in the case's haunted past, a descent into one of France's darkest chapters. The fall of France in 1940 had split the country in two. The Nazi-occupied North and the collaborationist South ruled from Vichy. The Vichy regime, far from being merely submissive to German power, actively participated in the persecution of Jews. They created the milice, a ruthless paramilitary police force charged with hunting down those considered enemies of the state: Jews, resistance fighters, communists, even suspected dissenters. Touvier found his purpose there. He rose quickly within the milice ranks, eventually overseeing intelligence. He became known not just for his administrative cruelty, but for his personal role in acts of terror. In one particularly grotesque act, he personally selected 7 Jewish men to be executed, simply for being Jews. They were taken to a wall, lined up, and shot. He later admitted to the selection himself. These weren't just wartime orders. These were acts of hate. Ideologically devout, Touvier believed his enemies were not people, but infestations to be eliminated. He wasn't merely following orders. He was inventing them. After the war, France attempted to purge itself of collaborators in what became known as the Epuration. Touvier, branded a traitor, faced a death sentence, but he vanished. Like others of his kind, he did not rely solely on cunning. He had help, networks of supporters who shared his ideology, or at the very least, his shame. Perhaps most troubling were his ties to the Catholic Church. A devout Catholic himself, Touvier turned to the Church for sanctuary, and the Church, or at least parts of it, gave it to him. Recordon, sifting through decades-old dossiers, began to see a pattern: clerical involvement, mentions of monasteries, whispered connections between religious orders and the fugitive. The Church, an institution sworn to moral authority, became a part of the story not in redemption, but in concealment. But the question remained: was Paul Touvier still alive? He had once planted a false death notice in a newspaper, an audacious move to seal his vanishing. With no body, no documentation, and no confirmation, investigators had nothing but suspicion. So the hunt continued. Colonel Recordon and his colleague, veteran investigator Dominique Bell, pursued the faintest traces: letters, witness testimonies, contacts of supporters. They narrowed in on one area: Lyon. A familiar name appeared. Touvier had once used the address of the Lyon Archdiocese. The possibility that he had been sheltered by religious officials grew more plausible, even likely. Recordon believed that uncovering church involvement was key, but this was no ordinary inquiry. To gain access to the Archbishop's archives required delicate diplomacy. The magistrate leading the case accompanied Recordon on a journey south to Lyon, where they secured a private meeting with the Archbishop. Recordon waited outside. It was a game of trust, negotiation, and discretion. Within the walls of the church, hidden truths may have been preserved in silence and sealed envelopes, but Recordon was prepared to open them. He was navigating a world where history, politics, and religion collided, where sympathies for the old regime still lingered, quietly nurtured by certain factions within the church and society. Touvier, a man condemned by history, was still protected by those who saw him not as a criminal, but as a martyr of a defeated ideology. The deeper the investigation reached, the more it exposed not just a man, but a country still divided by the legacy of occupation. For every official working toward justice, there were those eager to forget, or worse, to defend. The pursuit of Paul Touvier was never simply a search for one man. It was a confrontation with the unresolved soul of a nation. Colonel Recordon knew it. Dominique Bell knew it. And if the clues buried in the archdiocese led where they suspected, then perhaps France, too long silent, would finally be forced to reckon with the truth it had buried alongside its collaborators. This was not merely about capturing a war criminal. It was about confronting the last unpunished threads of Vichy's betrayal, threads woven through faith, bureaucracy, and denial. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Justice had waited too long. But it had not vanished. Not yet. Not all fugitives hide in darkness. Some wrap themselves in the robes of the sacred, cloaked in reverence, protected by silence, slipping between the lines of morality and complicity. In the late 1980s, more than 4 decades after the end of World War II, France was still haunted by one of its most chilling wartime figures, Paul Touvier, a man whose name was whispered with the same revulsion as traitor and executioner, a Frenchman who turned against his own people. As a leading figure in the milice, Vichy's paramilitary police force, Touvier hunted Jews and resistance fighters with ruthless devotion, committing atrocities under the guise of authority, but always with personal conviction. Yet somehow, through the passage of years, shifting governments, and an ever-thickening fog of bureaucracy and politics, he remained free. That freedom was not accidental. It was maintained, sustained, and, most disturbingly, protected by individuals and networks that still, after all those years, believed in the cause he once served. Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon, a man known for his discipline and tenacity, was now tasked with an almost mythical mission: to unearth the ghost of Touvier from the sanctified stone walls of France itself. What he soon uncovered was not just a fugitive, but a web of silent alliances and religious shelter, stretching back into the very moral heart of the nation. From the outset, Recordon faced resistance not only from the man he sought, but from the very institutions meant to uphold justice. The investigation took him deep into files, whispers, and trails long cold, yet one pattern emerged persistently: the shadow of the Catholic Church. Touvier, a devout Catholic from a devout family, had long understood that if he were to survive in France, it would be not among the sympathetic elite or the criminal underworld, but within the cloisters of faith. The Church, with its walls of secrecy, traditions of protection, and a long and troubled relationship with Vichy, became the natural harbor for a man like Touvier. When Recordon petitioned the Archbishop of Lyon for access to ecclesiastical archives, the answer came swiftly and predictably: no. It was a refusal that did not surprise him, only fueled his suspicions further. To be denied entry was to be shown a direction. If cooperation could not be forced through the front door, Recordon would find another way in. 9 months into the investigation, Recordon's hypothesis hardened into near certainty. Touvier was hiding within a Catholic community, likely among far-right fundamentalist networks that continued to resist the secular spirit of post-war France. One such network led the team to the remote monastery of Saint-Joseph de Clarfelds in central France, a secluded and strict order known for its secrecy and sympathy toward traditionalist ideology. The detective's strategy shifted. Undercover officer Belage, posing as a recently released convict in search of spiritual refuge, entered the monastery. It was a world apart, cloistered, self-contained, deeply mistrustful of outsiders. He lived among the brothers, sweeping the corridors, sharing silent meals, observing every movement, listening for names, faces, slips of tongue. But the walls did not speak. The silence held firm. The mission yielded no sign of Touvier. It was demoralizing, but Recordon was not deterred. If the abbeys would not offer truth, perhaps the wires would. The team expanded their operation to include phone taps, discreetly installed and routed directly to the basement of their offices. Calls from religious communities across the country were now under surveillance. At first, there was only noise, the drone of the faithful. But soon, a pattern emerged. Repeated voices, coded phrases, familiar tones. Then, a single break, the sound of anxiety on a line after a national newspaper published an investigative article exposing the possibility that Touvier was being sheltered by right-wing Catholic sympathizers. One caller, alarmed, muttered, "Our friend Paul is not going to be happy." And with that, the veil began to lift. Recordon's attention turned to Jean-Pierre Lévesque, head of the clandestine Catholic sect known as the Knights of Notre Dame. On a call with Dom Lafond, the abbot of the Benedictine monastery of Saint-Paul-de-Wisque, Lévesque's voice betrayed more than concern. It revealed a network. With the magistrate's approval, Recordon launched simultaneous raids, one on the monastery, another on Lévesque's residence. Belage led the monastery search with a warrant in hand, met by stonewalling and deflection. The abbot insisted on calling his superiors, sure that invoking higher authority would halt the intrusion. But Recordon's men were unshaken. They detained Lafond for questioning. 48 hours of silence passed before cracks appeared. In a guarded confession, the abbot admitted knowledge of a broader conspiracy to shield Touvier, implicating the Knights of Notre Dame. The sacred had been breached, not by force, but by the insistence of truth. Interrogating Lévesque, investigators quickly connected him to Touvier's wartime past. He had fought alongside Nazi SS officers. His home's basement was filled with relics of betrayal, documents, correspondence, ideological debris from the days of occupation. He and Touvier were not just ideological cousins, they were historical accomplices. Touvier's name had once been spoken in the same breath as Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Barbie, a Gestapo monster, headed German intelligence in the city. Touvier, as head of intelligence for the milice, was his French mirror. But while Barbie was eventually captured and sentenced, Touvier had eluded the same fate. He remained the last unjudged figure of Vichy terror. His crimes were not abstract. They were documented, personal, precise. In one case, he and his men stormed a synagogue in Lyon, arrested the worshippers, including Vladimir Zelenko's mother, and sent them to Auschwitz. Stories like these gave faces to the statistics. Of the 880,000 Jews who lived in France during the occupation, approximately 76,000 were deported. Touvier helped make that happen. He had not just served the regime, he had fed it, fueled it, embodied it. And now all evidence suggested that he was still alive, protected, moving within the folds of France's religious fringe. As Recordon confronted Lévesque, he tried a calculated ruse. He hinted that other hunters, Nazi hunters, were closing in, individuals far less interested in trials and far more comfortable with revenge. He invoked names like Serge Klarsfelds and Simon Wiesenthal. Lévesque, who had thus far refused to speak, suddenly shifted. His eyes narrowed. His silence cracked. The threat of rogue justice disturbed him more than lawful arrest. He had harbored Touvier in the name of faith, loyalty, perhaps delusion, but he had not considered what might happen if the hunters came with guns rather than warrants. Recordon's ploy was not a bluff. The Klarsfelds were very real, and so was justice. L'évêque now faced a choice: continue to shield a war criminal or offer him up and walk away with his secrets intact. Recordon waited. The silence that followed was no longer impenetrable. It was pregnant with the weight of a nation's reckoning. The sacred walls had begun to crumble. The pursuit was no longer just of a man, but of truth itself. Justice, long delayed, does not fade with time. It coils in the shadows, quietly waiting for the moment when silence can no longer protect the guilty. For over 40 years, Paul Touvier had lived beneath that shadow, shielded by the pious veils of faith, by sympathizers disguised as saints, and by the deep cracks within the walls of post-war France. Convicted in absentia for treason and war crimes after the liberation, Touvier had somehow escaped judgment, evading capture with a mixture of cunning, silence, and a loyal network that helped him remain invisible. Now, decades later, as investigators neared the final leg of their pursuit, the illusion that had protected Touvier for so long was beginning to unravel. Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon and his team had uncovered more than a fugitive. They had pierced a sanctum of complicity stretching through monasteries, fundamentalist Catholic sects, and into the heart of French memory itself. It was not only a criminal they were chasing, but the denial of a nation. And they were finally closing in. The final break came not from force, but persuasion. Recordon confronted Jean-Pierre L'évêque, leader of a radical Catholic group known as the Knights of Notre Dame, men who had supported Touvier financially and ideologically. With subtle strategy, Recordon planted fear. If justice didn't come through the courts, it might come through the hands of independent Nazi hunters, people like Serge and Beda Klarsfeld or Simon Wiesenthal. The hint of danger cracked L'évêque's resolve. He admitted that every month the Knights were sending 3,000 francs, about $600 at the time, to a woman in Paris. It was the lifeline Touvier needed to survive. That one admission pulled a tangled web into sharp focus. Touvier's escape had never been accidental. It had been carefully sustained by a network of ideologues who refused to let go of their Vichy loyalty. One of those agents was Madame Penou, an elderly secretary of a Catholic charity in Paris. When Recordon arrived at her door, she resisted. She claimed she could not speak unless permitted by a priest, invoking not French law, but divine authority. After a tense wait, the priest gave his blessing. Penou disclosed the truth. For years, she had sent funds to Paul Touvier at a remote Carmelite convent 200 miles south of Paris. Her sense of religious duty, she explained, compelled her to help. In her mind, aiding a fugitive was not a betrayal of law, but a fulfillment of faith. The case now moved with urgency. Time, once on Touvier's side, was slipping away. A strike team was assembled. Recordon and his team flew south, while a second unit traveled by car. They could not afford a leak. If Touvier sensed he was being tracked, he would vanish again. They reached the convent and were met by startled nuns. Recordon explained their purpose, questioned the abbess and the abbot, and began a systematic search. The abbot feigned ignorance. But inside one of the outbuildings, investigators opened a trunk bearing an alias they recognized: Paul Lacroix. Inside were documents, photographs, and medals, including the Iron Cross, a chilling memento of Nazi affiliation. Nazi propaganda writings by Philippe Henriot, the infamous Vichy broadcaster assassinated by the resistance in 1944, lay alongside family photographs of Touvier with his wife and children. The evidence was irrefutable. Touvier had lived there, and he had left only recently. Recordon pressed the abbot again. The priest insisted he knew nothing, but the Mother Superior intervened. She demanded he swear on the cross that he was telling the truth. The priest faltered. Under the weight of faith and fear, he admitted the truth. Touvier had moved 2 weeks earlier to another monastery, Saint Joseph de Nice, located nearly 500 miles to the south on the Mediterranean coast. It was a pivotal revelation. The detectives now had a precise location, but no time to spare. The operation could not afford delay. At 11 p.m., with his team exhausted but energized by the breakthrough, Recordon took the wheel himself and drove through the night at speeds of 150–160 kilometers per hour. He had not slept in days, but there was clarity in motion. The past was finally catching up with the present. With him was the first recent photograph of Touvier they had seen in years, a simple image that now gave a face to the man they had only known through files, aliases, and testimonies. As dawn approached, Recordon contacted the authorities in Nice and instructed them to encircle the monastery. No one in, no one out. He carried the arrest warrant in his pocket and refused to speak of the case over the phone. Too much had been risked to allow a single word to slip. When they arrived, the monastery was already surrounded by undercover officers. Recordon and his colleagues split up to enter from both the front and rear simultaneously. The trap was set. The air, heavy with anticipation, was no longer still. After decades of evasion, denial, and hidden alliances, the hunt for Paul Touvier had reached its final hour. There are moments in history when the weight of time, memory, and truth all converge in a single breath, in a narrow stairwell, in the uncertain heartbeat of a man approaching a closed door. After more than 40 years of searching, of navigating shadows and secrets, of following whispers through monasteries and phone lines, French investigators stood at the edge of closure. But even as they approached the monastery in Nice, even with the intelligence pointing clearly to this hidden refuge, they were not sure. Doubt lingered like a final test. Was Paul Touvier truly behind these walls, or had he once again vanished into silence? When Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon knocked on the heavy wooden door, a priest answered, visibly startled and trembling. Fear flickered behind his eyes, fear not just of intrusion, but of revelation. As he tried to block their entry, Recordon acted swiftly, wedging his foot into the threshold, forcing the door open with a sharp thrust. While Recordon held the priest, his team fanned out inside the monastery's hushed interior. In the courtyard, another team broke down a side door, reuniting with Recordon near a central staircase. 4 officers moved with quiet urgency, their boots echoing on the stone. Together with the priest still gripped by the sleeve, Recordon climbed the stairs. At the landing, they split in 2. One team moved left, Recordon moved right. The corridor was narrow, lined with closed doors, each one a possibility, each one carrying the weight of decades of evasion. Behind one, the future waited. Then, stillness. One investigator froze at a doorway, framed in pale light. Recordon followed his gaze, and there, in the center of the room, stood a man who had once believed time would protect him. Paul Touvier. His posture was rigid, but his face betrayed no panic, only recognition. His sharp, pale blue eyes gave him away immediately. Recordon, who had spent years imagining this encounter, felt the air leave him. It wasn't just the sight of Touvier that struck him, but the symbolism. The blue-eyed officer, cold and authoritarian, like the villains of war films, burned into Franz's memory. A moment later, a woman entered, followed by 2 adult children, his family. They began to cry, their lives now unraveling in seconds. Touvier snapped at them to be silent, to return to their rooms. They obeyed without a word. It was a chilling display, a reminder that the man before them was not just an old fugitive. He was still the commanding voice of the milice's intelligence branch, the same man who had sent innocents to their deaths with such calculated conviction. Recordon saw not just the man, but the system he represented. For the children, the tragedy was layered. They were in their 30s, but they had never known freedom, never had a life beyond the walls of monasteries, always hidden, always defined by the sins of their father. When Recordon made the call confirming the arrest, his voice carried both relief and gravity. For those who had hunted Touvier, it was a moment of thunderous triumph. The culmination of countless hours, setbacks, false leads, and unwavering belief. For Recordon, it was a personal release. "I won," he said, not with arrogance, but with the weight of history on his shoulders. In that moment, his thoughts did not turn to celebration, but to the millions who never saw justice, the ones who died nameless behind the barbed wire of concentration camps. He thought of them, of their stolen futures, of their silenced voices, and finally, with Touvier standing motionless before him, he thought, now is the time for justice. 11. The story of justice delayed but not denied reached its crescendo with the capture of Paul Touvier, a man whose crimes during France's darkest era remained unanswered for over 40 years. His arrest was not just the closing act of a prolonged manhunt, but a loud and public confrontation with France's buried complicity. When news of his capture broke, the streets outside the courthouse swarmed with journalists, their cameras capturing the face of a man who had evaded judgment since the collapse of Vichy. Charged with 6 counts of crimes against humanity, Touvier stood before a nation that had waited too long to hear his words. Yet, when he spoke, it was not with remorse, but with denial. "I dispute having committed crimes against humanity. I was only doing my job." There was no regret, no reflection, only the brittle armor of a man frozen in ideology, untouched by time or consequence. The trial revealed more than his past. It illuminated the shadowed corners of the French Catholic Church that had offered him sanctuary, forcing the nation to reconcile with the institutions that silently harbored its traitors. And as if history whispered a cruel reminder, within days of his arrest, anti-Semitic graffiti appeared on a synagogue in Rouen, proof that the ideologies Touvier once served had not completely vanished. When his trial finally began in Versailles, a palace once symbolizing France's golden age, it served as a paradoxical stage for a nation still wounded. Among the trial's most chilling revelations were Touvier's so-called green notebooks, personal journals kept during the 1980s. Despite his courtroom denial of harboring any remaining hatred, the contents betrayed a man still steeped in anti-Semitic venom, a man unrepentant and unchanged. Those notebooks sealed his fate. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, Touvier was sentenced to life imprisonment, becoming the first French citizen to be judged by his own people for such crimes. For survivors, like the child of a woman he had personally arrested and sent to Auschwitz, the verdict was not just a legal milestone, but a moral reckoning. Touvier had haunted their lives. His punishment, though late, offered a fragment of peace. But while France was facing its internal ghosts, across the Atlantic, another hunt was reaching its climax. In his modest Vienna office at the Jewish Documentation Center, Simon Wiesenthal, the world's most renowned Nazi hunter, continued his tireless work. He was the keeper of files, the curator of names, and the embodiment of persistence. One day, an unexpected figure entered his office, a drunken man who offered information in exchange for money. If Wiesenthal paid him $7,000, he claimed he would reveal the whereabouts of one of the Holocaust's most prolific murderers, Franz Stangl. Wiesenthal listened. Stangl had commanded a killing machine, responsible for the deaths of more than 800,000 souls. He was not a faceless bureaucrat, lost in the machinery of genocide. He was one of its architects. An Austrian policeman turned SS officer, Stangl had risen quickly through the Nazi ranks. His indoctrination began at Hartheim Castle, where the T4 euthanasia program trained men in the clinical art of murder, gassing the disabled and mentally ill under the guise of racial purity. These were not just killings, they were rehearsals for industrial genocide. Selected personally by Heinrich Himmler, Stangl eventually assumed command at Sobibor and later Treblinka, where mass extermination was mechanized with a chilling efficiency. He had proven himself to the regime, a loyal servant who showed neither hesitation nor mercy. After the war, Stangl had fled Europe, finding refuge in Brazil. In the sprawling city of São Paulo, he built a new life with his wife and daughters. The German expatriate community welcomed him. Among them, he found comfort and anonymity. They sang old songs, toasted to lost glories, and celebrated Hitler's birthday. It was a grotesque parody of normalcy. Stangl found work in a car factory and climbed the social ladder. His past, to the unknowing, remained hidden behind the warm smile of a neighbor. But Wiesenthal did not forget. Carrying a photo of Stangl in his wallet for years, he waited patiently for the opportunity. When the drunken informant handed him an address, Wiesenthal's instincts sharpened. He verified the lead quietly, contacting trusted operatives in Brazil. Secrecy was vital. Any leak could send Stangl fleeing into the jungle or deeper into the expatriate underground. Wiesenthal had learned this the hard way. He moved carefully, deliberately. Justice, after all, is not a sprint, but a slow and relentless pursuit. The revelations surrounding both Touvier and Stangl were not just about the individuals. They were about systems of silence, institutions, whether religious, governmental, or communal, had enabled these men to vanish. These hunts exposed more than fugitives. They unearthed the soil of complicity, the networks of protection, and the painful truth that evil rarely hides alone. As both stories unfolded, they converged not only in narrative, but in purpose. They reaffirmed a singular principle, that the passage of time does not erode responsibility. That memory, though fragile, can be sharpened into justice, and that the pursuit of truth, no matter how long it takes, remains the noblest endeavor of the human conscience. Not every story of war ends with surrender. Some continue in silence, stretched across decades like ghosts that refuse to vanish. For Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, the war never truly ended. It simply changed form. 20 years after the last shots of World War II were fired, the world had turned its attention elsewhere. The Cold War consumed public discourse, and interest in the atrocities of the Holocaust began to fade into the background noise of a new geopolitical struggle. In those years, few still cared about tracking down the remnants of Hitler's death machine. But Simon Wiesenthal remained unwavering. He carried the burden of memory with the precision of a historian and the tenacity of a bloodhound. In his small office at the Jewish Documentation Center, Wiesenthal gathered files, photographs, testimonies, evidence of crimes too great to ignore, even if the world had chosen to look away. One name high on his list was Franz Stangl. Stangl had once been a career policeman, a loyal Austrian who found purpose and elevation in the twisted ideology of Nazism. He rose through the ranks, aligning himself not just ideologically but functionally with the Nazi regime's core machinery of extermination. At Schloss Hartheim in Austria, Stangl participated in the T4 euthanasia program, where the disabled and mentally ill were murdered under the guise of genetic cleansing. There, he was trained not in war or defense, but in the administrative and emotional detachment required to oversee mass killing. From that proving ground, he was selected for a new, far darker mission, Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews of Poland. This was no battlefield assignment. It was an invitation to become a manager of genocide. Stangl ran death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. These were not concentration camps. They were factories of death, processing centers for the final solution. Stangl's job was to ensure maximum efficiency in extermination. Jews arrived by train, believing perhaps they were being relocated, comforted by the deception of flowers, clocks, and tidy uniforms. But behind that facade lay tunnels that led to gas chambers and crematoriums. The entire process, from disembarkation to incineration, was choreographed to take no longer than 30 minutes. Stangl watched over this horror in white gloves and polished boots, a bureaucrat of death. His detached professionalism masked the reality of what he oversaw. 800,000 murders at Treblinka alone. Wiesenthal made a silent promise to survivors. He would never stop hunting Stangl. In post-war Germany, a monumental trial of 10 former SS men who worked at Treblinka captured global attention. Stangl, notably, was not among them. He had vanished. The trial, though powerful, exposed a painful truth. Many of the most senior figures, like Stangl, had escaped justice. Unlike the foot soldiers, he had not wielded the knife himself. He had merely ensured the trains ran on time. The Allied powers had, in the confusion after the war, detained him in a POW camp, but they didn't realize who he truly was. And so, he simply walked away. The route of his escape led through a network known infamously as the Rat Lines, escape routes for former SS officers, often supported by elements within the Catholic Church. Stangl, like many others, found refuge through Bishop Alois Hudal in Rome, a key figure in the Vatican rat line. With the help of Hudal, Stangl secured forged papers and began a new life. From Rome, he traveled to Syria and eventually in 1951 to Brazil. There in São Paulo, he settled with his wife and daughters. He found work in a car factory, lived in a nice home in a German expatriate community, and celebrated birthdays with old Nazi songs. He had built a second life out of the ashes of his crimes. For years, he lived untouched. Then came a break. A man, drunk, desperate, walked into Wiesenthal's office and made an offer. For $7,000, he would reveal the exact whereabouts of Franz Stangl. Wiesenthal was skeptical, but the details proved too precise to ignore. He made the deal. The informant vanished, but the information held. Stangl was alive in São Paulo. Wiesenthal did not move hastily. He knew that extradition would be delicate. Secrecy was paramount. Working with trusted intermediaries, he confirmed Stangl's address and movements. Police Chief Romeo Tuma of São Paulo began surveillance, observing the former Nazis' routines, identifying a pattern. On an ordinary evening in February 1967, after Stangl had gone for a beer with his daughter, officers surrounded his home. There was no resistance. The man who had orchestrated the death of nearly 1 million people was taken quietly. News of the arrest rippled across the world. Stangl was extradited to Germany in June of that year. For Wiesenthal, the moment was significant, not just as a personal triumph, but as a testament that time does not erase guilt. The trial of Franz Stangl, held in Düsseldorf, was historic. It revealed in full the banality of evil. Witnesses spoke of the false calm at the Treblinka train platform, of the mechanical precision of murder. Stangl sat emotionless, insisting he had only followed orders, that he was merely an administrator. But the court saw through the defense. On December 22, 1970, Franz Stangl was found guilty of crimes against humanity. Sentenced to life, he would serve only a short time. In 1971, 4 months after agreeing to a prison interview, he died of a heart attack. But in that final interview, he dropped one last name. Gustav Wagner, another SS officer, another graduate of Schloss Hartheim, another man hiding in Brazil. The hunt was not over. Wiesenthal, even as one file closed, began opening another. Stangl's final betrayal of his comrade was perhaps the ultimate confession. When pressed, loyalty among killers falters. The SS motto, "My honor is loyalty," rang hollow in the prison yard. In death, Stangl became a map, one that would guide the hunters to the next name, the next ghost of a war that never really ended. In the silence that followed the verdict, Wiesenthal did not celebrate. He simply turned to his files. Another trail, another fugitive, another promise to keep. Because some stories must be finished. Some truths demand to be found, no matter how many years pass, no matter how thick the silence becomes. Not every fugitive fears the law. Some fear being forgotten. Gustav Wagner, one of the most sadistic architects of Nazi genocide, vanished into the depths of post-war exile like many of his comrades. But there was one man who refused to let time bury justice: Simon Wiesenthal. In an era when the world had turned its back on the horrors of the past, Wiesenthal remained vigilant, keeping alive the pursuit of men like Wagner when others had chosen amnesia over memory. It was not heroism that drove him, but obligation, a deep moral insistence that no matter how long it took, those responsible for industrial-scale cruelty would be held to account. Wagner was not merely a participant in evil. He glorified in it, relishing the power to play God. After gaining experience at Schloss Hartheim under the Nazis' T4 euthanasia program, where the mentally ill and disabled were gassed as unworthy of life, Wagner became deputy commandant under Franz Stangl at Sobibor, and later the commandant himself. The trail of corpses that followed him was vast. Over 200,000 lives ended under his authority. Wagner earned his nickname, the Beast, for a reason. Survivors spoke of a towering man who could kill without hesitation or remorse. One chilling story told of Wagner forcing a father and son to lean their heads together before shooting them both with a single bullet. In another, he executed a woman by first killing her baby in front of her. His atrocities were not acts of distant cruelty. They were personal, deliberate, grotesque performances of power. After the war, Wagner evaded Allied prosecution and returned quietly to Austria. His luck held long enough to meet up with his old mentor, Franz Stangl, and together they fled along the notorious Vatican rat lines to Brazil, slipping into anonymous lives within the German expatriate community of São Paulo. They were neighbors, friends, and fellow fugitives. For decades, they lived in comfort, protected by distance and by those who chose willful ignorance. But Wiesenthal had not forgotten. Even as world interest waned, even as Cold War politics shifted attention to new enemies, he persisted. His team eventually obtained a lead, an outdated Brazilian passport with Wagner's photo. The address, however, was no longer valid. For 7 long years, the search stalled until fate and foolishness intervened. A bizarre article in a Brazilian newspaper described a hotel party celebrating Hitler's birthday. The photos, taken by journalist Braz Brito and his team, showed elderly German men in folkloric attire surrounded by Nazi memorabilia. Wiesenthal requested all the images but found no confirmed photo of Wagner. So he gambled. He labeled one of the unidentified men as Gustav Wagner, added his SS number, and leaked the image back to the press. It was a calculated deception. His aim? To smoke out the real Wagner. And it worked. The real Wagner, now fearing exposure and assassination by other ex-Nazis or rogue justice seekers, turned himself in. He was arrested and detained in Brazil, admitting to being at Sobibor but denying any wrongdoing. With extradition requests pouring in from West Germany, Poland, and Israel, it seemed Wagner would finally face trial. But then, an extraordinary coincidence. A Sobibor survivor, Shlomo Schmeisner, happened to be living in Brazil and saw Wagner's face on TV. Shocked to be breathing the same air as his former tormentor, he flew to São Paulo to confront him. The police arranged a meeting between them, and Wagner, with chilling arrogance, told Schmeisner, "You should thank me. I let you live." It was the final piece of evidence needed to confirm his identity. Wagner's mind began to unravel in custody. Brazilian prisons were grim, and the weight of inevitable justice pushed him toward self-destruction. He attempted suicide multiple times, eating glass, slashing his wrists, and smashing his head. The once proud Nazi had become a caged animal, desperate and broken. And then came the most devastating blow, not from a courtroom, but from a ruling room in Brazil's Supreme Court. On a technicality, the justices refused to allow Wagner's extradition. He was released. The world recoiled in horror. Countries that had sought justice were denied it. Survivors were silenced again by legal apathy. But Wagner's freedom came at a price. He had been unmasked. He was no longer safe. Shortly thereafter, Wagner was found dead in his home, allegedly having stabbed himself in the chest. Officially ruled a suicide, the circumstances were suspicious. The wound was deep, the method uncommon for self-infliction. His family claimed innocence, but whispers circulated. Had someone taken revenge? Had fellow Nazis silenced him? Or had he truly fallen into the abyss of his own despair? Survivors like Schmeisner offered no confession, only cryptic smiles. Justice, if not delivered by law, may have come another way. For Simon Wiesenthal, Wagner's downfall was both a victory and a loss. He had fought against indifference, ignorance, and time itself. He had symbolized the enduring chase for truth in a world eager to forget. His tenacity brought justice to Franz Stangl, and indirectly to Wagner as well. For these 2 men alone, responsible for nearly 1 million deaths, Wiesenthal had refused to rest. And though his methods sometimes walk the line between strategy and deception, they were always guided by a singular truth. Those who butchered the innocent must never be allowed to vanish in peace. In 2004, Britain awarded him an honorary knighthood. A year later, he died at the age of 96, outliving most of the war criminals he hunted. His satisfaction was quiet but powerful. The world, at last, remembered.